The title of this video is Engineers versus Executives. The reason I've called this video Engineers versus Executives is because one of the very important types of people that you'll be engaging with when you're out in the workforce is executives, and engineers may not be prepared for what they find. Executives communicate in a different way to engineers, and I'm hoping that by highlighting some of these dimensions in this slide that you'll be better prepared in handling them than the average engineer. Executives ask different questions to engineers, and if you don't understand what questions they're asking, you won't be able to communicate with them. And it's very important because they're making the decisions about what you work on, who you work with, and how the organisation's run. So it's worthwhile paying attention to the different sorts of things that executives care about as opposed to engineers. This subject is all about thinking through questions, but the types of questions that you think through as an engineer is not the only questions there are. So the reason I've started to talk about executives is because they're a very important stakeholder, and you really need to keep in mind how you're going to engage with them in terms of content and style. Engineers typically think through some basic questions in terms of the how, the why, the where, the when, the which. They want to get things done, and they're interested in the technical difficulty of the how, the challenges. The how is what's upper mind for them. Executives, on the other hand, are focused more on things which are important, but not important for a very long period of time. They need to know, so what? The top of mind question for an executive is who cares and so what? They need to know the what, and so that's a point of common contact between executives and engineers, because engineers also talk about the what as well, but the engineers focus more on the how. So if you lose sight of the fact that executives are thinking about the why now and the now what, and you focus too much on the how, you won't be able to communicate with the executives, and it's really important. As I said to you in the past, first impressions matter. A bad title of an academic paper might get you a D, but if you're talking to an executive and you give them a bad title, well, they're going to be very busy people and they're not going to have time to talk to you, and you may not actually be able to get anything out of them because they're too busy. You need to talk in their language. As I said, the engineers focus largely on the how, the executives focus mostly on the what. But it's not just the content of the conversation in which executives differ from engineers. Engineers are a very particular type of people, and they actually communicate in a very specific way. If you've spent the last 4 years at university only hanging around with engineers, you will have found that by and large they communicate in similar ways. But when they get out there into the workplace, you'll discover that you need to be answerable to executives, but they may talk in a very different way to you. So we focused a little bit on content. Let's now talk about style. Executives may be very fast talkers, and you need to take the listener into account. If you look people in the eye when you're talking, it will slow you down a little bit because you'll get feedback from your listener. If you breathe, it'll slow you down. But if you are talking to somebody and they're using a different style to you, it will make things difficult. So let's talk about the 6 dimensions of communication style. I'm going to position engineers on one side and executives on the other, just to make the point. Now, some of you may communicate in a similar style to some executives, and some executives who may have been engineers may communicate in your style as well. But let's just focus on the extreme opposites and the consequences of those opposites, because it really matters. So in terms of focus, executives are often interested in dealing with the concepts. Engineers, on the other hand, are really interested in the details. If you're a concepts person and you don't have much time, and an engineer starts launching into a great deal of information in the detail, you're not going to be interested. You're not going to get to the point, and the executives aren't going to give you time to go through the detail no matter how fascinating you find it. You need to be very aware of whether they're interested in concept or detail. As an engineer, you may be an understater. There are understaters or overstaters. Engineers are taught to be very precise by nature. That precision becomes emphasized in the workplace as precision matters. But then if you're talking to somebody who's an overstater, an executive, somebody in marketing, somebody who adds a lot of gloss to the truth, engineers can find that really difficult because they're used to being very precise with their language and with the truth. But if they're going to communicate with people outside their discipline, they need to understand that overstatement sometimes and somewhere, it can be important. It's used for communicating excitement, it's used for building momentum. There are other purposes at work other than just precisely stating the facts. And as an engineer, you need to get used to that. In terms of timing, engineers are often very gradual. They'll talk slowly, they'll take their time, they'll work their way through from beginning to end in terms of the detail. And they love that devil in the detail. For executives, on the other hand, they will be rapid. They'll want the information really quickly. If an engineer is having a conversation with an executive, an engineer may think the executive is rushed and unplanned all over the place. The executive, though, may think the engineer is slow, not understanding, a blocker, getting in their way, not working hard enough for the business. This one can be really difficult to balance and to judge. Timing is very important. In terms of thinking, engineers are often linear thinkers. That is, they start with A, they go to B, and they finish with Z. But executives, on the other hand, can be all over the place. They jump from one thing to another thing. They can be extremely lateral, and they may end up in a great place. But if you put a lateral thinker, a really lateral thinker, and a linear thinker in the room, it can be really difficult for them to get along. In terms of evaluation, do you assess yourself more, or do you assess other people? And are you taking on more responsibilities than you should? That's sometimes how engineers evaluate themselves. Executives, on the other hand, are always evaluating other people, and sometimes their evaluations of other people are made through snap judgments. They'll overhear a conversation in the corridor, it'll be slow, it'll be measured, they'll decide that that person is a blocker. So you need to be really careful about how you communicate with other engineers, even in front of executives. Keep this in mind. Finally, in terms of the relationships, are you an initiator or do you respond? Are you proactive or are you reactive? Are you making things happen or are you letting things happen to you? You need to be aware that in relationships, moves are made and those moves can be upfront or lagging behind. Just because you like to think, just because you like to take things slowly, take things carefully, work things through to A to Z, don't get left behind. Watch how things move and try and take charge where you can, because it's not like answering questions when you're in a relationship with executives. You need to move at their speed. So they're the 6 dimensions of communication style: focus, emphasis, timing, thinking, evaluation, and relationship. Keep them all in mind and be very clear that you're channeling in the same way with that audience as you are with another engineer. Watch their style, imitate their style, work out what they've got time for. If you're slow, you need to be really careful that you prepare. So you go in there with your 3-minute soundbite, you speak with authority, you know what you're talking about, you're prepared. You don't have to do any of the thinking on the fly, because if you're a slow, methodical thinker and you're put in a room with a fast executive, you're not going to make much of an impression. And that's the truth. The responsibility for understanding is an interesting point. If you read an academic paper, and I've read many, and if you don't understand them, is it your fault? Well, the really good news is, as a reader, you're off the hook. If it is not your fault as a reader, if you read a paper and you don't get it. If the material is too difficult, the paper should point you in the past direction to history that you can then follow through on, that you can figure out until you can reach a point where you can understand the paper. So intellectually, you can figure it out by following through the citation trail. But if you're the reader and you're not getting it and you understand the history, well, it's got to be the fault of the writer. Now, writers can write complex writing for many ways. The complex writing may gratuitously complicate complex ideas or simple ideas. Things don't have to be complicated. You don't need to impress people with your complexity. If you're the reader, you want to get the information that's useful to you as quickly as possible. And if you're the writer, you want to structure the information in such a way that the reader can get that value as quickly as possible. So as a starting engineer, as a novice, it's not your fault if you're reading things and they seem difficult. Go easy on yourself. But if you've been in the game for a while and you've written a few publications, well, it's all on you. The responsibility is on the writer. When you're speaking to an executive, if they cannot understand you, unfortunately, it's your fault. They're in a position of power, and if you get into a room with them, you're not prepared, you don't understand their communication style, well, it can actually be a career-limiting move. You need to be able to speak their language. So have a chat to other engineers, be prepared. You need to know how to engage.